The person pointing the gun at my lover wasn't a jealous husband or a rival from a forgotten life. It was my own son. His hand, the same one I'd taught to grip a baseball bat, was shaking, the barrel of the hunting rifle wavering between the man standing beside me and the turbulent Pacific sky. The ocean roared below the cliffside deck, a furious, churning gray that mirrored the chaos in my son's eyes. "Get away from him, Mom," Kieran's voice cracked, a terrifying fracture between the boy he was and the man he was trying to be. The man beside me, Leo, didn't flinch. He simply moved, placing his body partially in front of mine, a shield made of muscle and regret. His stillness was the most frightening thing of all. It was the calm of a man who had stared down worse things than a terrified 20-year-old with his father's rifle. It was the calm that had drawn me in and wrecked me completely. "Kieran, put the gun down," I said, my voice a low, steady command I'd perfected over 25 years as an emergency room physician, the voice I used when a life was bleeding out on my table. Now it was my own life, my own heart, laid bare on the splintered redwood of my deck. I would never have thought this could happen, but then, I'd never thought I'd be alive after 40, let alone be standing on a California cliff, in love with a man half my age who was the son of the colleague I'd watched die. Mistakes. I had made a career of fixing them. I just never realized the biggest one would be my own. It all started on a Tuesday, 3 months earlier. One of those days in Big Sur where the fog rolls in so thick it feels like the rest of the world has been erased. I was in my greenhouse, a glass sanctuary clinging to the cliff's edge, surrounded by my collection of rare and poisonous flora, belladonna, monkshood, the deceptively delicate rosary pea. I'd retired from the ER 2 years ago, after a night I couldn't unsee, and traded saving human lives for curating beautiful things that could kill you. The irony was not lost on me. My solitude was a carefully constructed fortress. After my divorce, and then my retirement, the silence was a welcome balm. My son Kieran was away at college, and my life had settled into a quiet rhythm of soil, sea, and mist. That day, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway was a violent intrusion. No one came here unannounced. I stepped out of the greenhouse, wiping dirt from my hands onto my jeans, and saw him. He unfolded himself from a dusty, beaten-up Jeep, a tall silhouette against the milky white fog. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in faded jeans, and a worn Henley that did little to conceal the corded muscle in his arms. His hair was a dark, unruly mess, and his face was all sharp angles and shadows, a map of places I couldn't imagine, but I knew his eyes. They were his father's eyes, a startling, intelligent blue that held the same capacity for intense focus and profound sadness. He was Leo, the son of my late mentor, Alistair, who had fallen from these very cliffs 5 years ago during a research trip. An accident, the coroner had ruled, a tragedy that had sent me spiraling out of the medical profession and into this self-imposed exile. "Dr. Vance?" he said. His voice was rougher than I'd expected, a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "I don't use that title anymore," I said, my arms crossing instinctively over my chest. "I'm Helena." He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the property, the wild, windswept garden, the modern glass house, the turbulent ocean below. He loved this place, he said. It wasn't an accusation, but it felt like one. My father. Yes, he did. "I'm Leo." As if I didn't know. I'd seen pictures of him as a boy in Alistair's office, a smiling kid with a soccer trophy. The man before me now looked like he'd seen the ugly spine of the world and hadn't smiled since. "What do you want, Leo?" "I was in the area," he lied, and we both knew it. His hands were shoved in his pockets, his posture deceptively casual. "Thought I'd see the place he talked so much about." I should have sent him away. My fortress had its rules, and the first one was no ghosts. But I saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hand as he brushed his hair from his forehead. I saw the ghost of his father, and against my better judgment, I heard myself say, "The fog's getting thicker. You shouldn't drive the coast road. You can stay the night." That first night, we moved around each other like wary predators. I made a simple dinner of soup and bread, and we ate in the vast, echoing silence of my kitchen. He told me he was a photographer, just back from a long assignment in Syria. He spoke of it in clipped, detached sentences, his eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond my shoulder. He was describing hell with the emotional investment of a man reading a grocery list. It was a defense mechanism I knew well. I'd used it myself for years. "You've seen a lot," I said quietly. His eyes snapped to mine, sharp and assessing. "And so have you, I imagine. In the ER. "I've seen what happens when things break," I admitted. "Bones, bodies, hearts. And could you always fix them?" he asked, his gaze intense. "No," I said. "No one can." Later, I was woken by a strangled cry from the guest room. I found him tangled in his sheets, his body rigid, his breathing shallow and fast. He was trapped in a nightmare, his face a mask of terror. I didn't think. I reacted as a doctor, a mother, a human being. I sat on the edge of his bed and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Leo," I said, my voice low and calm. "You're not there. You're in California. You're safe." His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. For a terrifying second, he looked at me not as a person, but as a threat. Then, recognition dawned, and the terror was replaced by a wave of raw, humiliating shame. He sat up, pulling away from my touch, running a hand over his face. "Sorry," he muttered, his back to me. "Bad dream." "It's all right," I said, but it wasn't. The air in the room was thick with his trauma. I could almost smell it, the metallic tang of adrenaline and fear. I retreated to my room, but I didn't sleep. I stood at my window watching the fog-shrouded sea and knew that my carefully constructed peace had been irrevocably breached. He didn't leave the next day. He said his Jeep needed work, another lie we both accepted. Instead, he started working in the garden. He repaired the section of fence that had been damaged in the last winter storm, his movements precise and powerful. He helped me haul bags of volcanic soil up from the driveway, never complaining about the weight or the treacherous path. We worked for hours in a comfortable silence, speaking only when necessary. I found myself watching him. The way the sun caught the gold flecks in his dark hair, the focused intensity in his eyes, as he concentrated on a task, the surprising gentleness of his large hands as he handled a delicate orchid. He was a study in contradictions, brutal strength and quiet sensitivity, deep trauma and surprising resilience. One evening, he found me in the greenhouse, staring at a blooming aconitum, the monkshood. Its vibrant purple flowers belied the deadly poison within. "Beautiful," he said, standing beside me. "And lethal," I added. "Every part of it." "The most beautiful things often are," he murmured, his eyes not on the flower, but on my face. The air grew still, charged with an unspoken energy. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of clean sweat and earth on his skin. My heart, a tired, methodical muscle, began to beat with a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. "Why did you really come here, Leo?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He was silent for a long moment. "My father's journals," he said. "He wrote about this place, about his work. The last volume is missing, the one from the month he died. I thought maybe he left it here." "I don't have it," I said quickly, too quickly. He looked at me, his blue eyes searching, analytical. "Are you sure?" The kiss, when it happened, was days later. It was raining, a cold, driving, slate-gray rain that blurred the line between the sea and the sky. We were soaked, having rushed to bring a collection of fragile desert succulents under cover. Shivering, we stood in the kitchen, dripping on the slate floor. I handed him a towel, and as he took it, his fingers brushed against mine. The contact was like a lit match to dry tinder. The air crackled. He dropped the towel and cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking my cheekbones. His eyes held mine, and in their depths, I saw a raw, aching loneliness that mirrored my own. "Helena," he breathed, and it was half a plea, half a prayer. I didn't pull away. In that moment, I didn't care that he was 28 and I was 51. I didn't care that he was the son of my dead friend. All I cared about was the searing, undeniable truth that this haunted man saw me, not as a retired doctor or a grieving widow, but as a woman. His kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, hungry, a drowning man's gasp for air. It was a collision of shared grief and unspoken longing. I answered him with a ferocity that shocked me, my hands tangling in his wet hair, pulling him closer. We were two broken things, finding a temporary solace in the wreckage. The days that followed were a secret, feverish dream. We made love with a raw, exploratory urgency, our bodies trying to say what our words could not. In the daylight, we were careful, reserved, but at night, in the darkness, with the sound of the ocean crashing below, we shed our armor. He told me about the things he'd seen, the faces that haunted his sleep, and I, in turn, told him about the night I quit, the young boy on my table who had died from a senseless accident, a boy who had the same bright, curious eyes as my own son. We were two confessors, finding absolution in each other's arms. But the ghost of his father and his missing journal was always there, an unspoken question between us. Kieran's arrival was a brutal awakening. He'd finished his semester early and decided to surprise me. The surprise was entirely mine. He walked in to find Leo and me in the kitchen, laughing over a shared cup of coffee, our hands inches apart on the counter. The intimacy, though unspoken, was as clear as the glass walls of the house. Kieran froze in the doorway. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, sharp suspicion. He had his father's protective streak, a trait that had always warmed me, but now sent a chill down my spine. "Kieran," I said, my voice unnaturally bright. "What a surprise." "Clearly," he said, his eyes flicking from me to Leo. He didn't recognize him, not at first. "This is Leo," I explained, my heart beginning to pound. A friend of Alistair's." "Alistair's son," Leo corrected, standing up and extending a hand. His movements were calm, measured. Kieran ignored the hand. "What are you doing here?" he asked, the question aimed at Leo, but his accusing gaze fixed on me. The next few days were a tense, cold war fought in a house that was suddenly far too small. Kieran was polite to Leo with a chilling formality, but he followed me everywhere, his questions relentless. Who was this man? Why was he here? Didn't I think it was strange, him showing up years after his father died on my property? He was planting seeds of doubt, a poison I had been trying to ignore. One night, after Leo had gone to his room, Kieran confronted me. "I don't trust him, Mom. There was always talk after Alistair died. People at the university. They said he was obsessed with you, that his research had gotten erratic." "That's ridiculous gossip," I snapped. "Is it?" he pressed, his eyes pleading. "He falls off a cliff here, and 5 years later his son, a man your age, just happens to show up and move in. Don't you see how this looks?" I saw. Of course, I saw. But I also saw the way Leo looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching, with a tenderness that unraveled me. I felt the way his presence had filled the echoing emptiness of my life. The breaking point came a week later. I found Kieran in my office, my laptop open. He'd been going through my emails. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. "Looking for the truth," he shot back. "Since you won't tell me, I found this." He pointed to the screen. It was an old email from Alistair, dated the day before he died. "Helena, I have to tell you something. I can't live with it anymore. Meet me at the cliffs. I've made a terrible mistake." "He was going to confess something to you," Kieran said, his voice trembling. "And then he was dead." "What did he do, Mom? What did you do?" Before I could answer, Leo appeared in the doorway. He had heard everything. His face was a pale, tight mask. "What mistake?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. And then, the fortress I had built around my heart finally crumbled. "The journal," I whispered, turning to Leo. "I have it." I led them to my bedroom and retrieved a locked metal box from the back of my closet. I had found the journal tucked under a rock near the cliff's edge the day after Alistair died. I had hidden it, terrified of what it might contain, of the scandal it could cause. I handed the journal to Leo. His hands trembled as he read the last entry aloud. It wasn't a confession of an affair or some professional misconduct. It was the confession of a broken man. Alistair had falsified data in his most famous research paper, a small lie that had spun out of control, earning him accolades he didn't deserve. He couldn't live with the guilt. The email wasn't a threat. It was a suicide note. And he had come to me, his most trusted friend, to be his witness. But I had been late that day. A call from the hospital, a pileup on the highway. By the time I arrived, he was gone. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a choked sob from Leo. He sank onto the bed, the journal falling from his hands. The ghost he had been chasing wasn't a murderer. It was his father's shame. My guilt wasn't over a crime. It was over not being there to save my friend. In that moment of shared, devastating truth, Kieran looked from Leo's broken form to my tear-streaked face. He saw not a predator and a victim, but two grieving people bound by a tragedy he had never understood, and that is when he left the room and returned with the rifle. He saw our shared grief not as a resolution, but as a final, terrible proof of a conspiracy. He saw me choosing this man's pain over his protection. Which brings us back to the deck, the roaring ocean below, my son's trembling hands. "Kieran," I said, stepping away from Leo, my hands held up in a gesture of surrender. "Listen to me. There is no enemy here. There is only pain. Alistair's pain. Leo's. Mine. Even yours. It's all tangled together. But this," I gestured to the gun, "this will only create more." Leo spoke, his voice low and steady. "Your mother didn't do anything wrong, Kieran. Neither did my father. He was just lost. I know what that feels like. To be so lost, you think there's no way back." He was speaking to my son, but his words were for me. Slowly, agonizingly, I saw the fury in Kieran's eyes soften, replaced by a wave of confusion and grief. The rifle barrel lowered. He looked at me, his face crumpling. "I thought I was protecting you," he whispered. "I know," I said, my own tears finally falling. "I know you did." I didn't know then if our story had a future. I didn't know if my son would ever understand, or if Leo and I could build something real from the ashes of our shared ghosts. But as I walked toward my son, and Leo stood his ground, a silent guardian at my back, I understood the lesson my poisonous garden had been trying to teach me all along. Healing is not always a gentle process. Sometimes it's a dangerous bloom, thriving on the very cliffs where you thought you would fall. It's not about finding a love that is safe. It's about finding one that is brave enough to stand with you in the storm and trust that you will survive it together. And that is a truth worth fighting for.